All right, well, it's about 4 minutes after 1, and I guess we can go ahead and get started. My name is Andy Flavin. I'm an attorney with J3.1 Pepper, a law firm. We have offices all over the United States. I'm based in Richmond, Virginia. I'll also be chairing this session, and I think we may still have one more presenter coming, but at least we've got three of the four of us here. And thanks for joining after lunch and pulling yourself away from it. All right. This information I think is probably fairly basic for most of the folks that are in here, but so I apologize if this is old news. And I should say I'm going to be talking about regulatory considerations for EV charging. So at a high level, state energy regulation. I call it more, I guess, state and local building code type issues, and then environmental considerations. But before I get into that, again, just making sure, and I think, again, this is probably old news for a lot of folks, but just, when I'm talking about charging here, talking about there are three primarily levels of charging. Level 1, 120 volts, roughly equivalent, say, plugging in like a hair dryer at home. Level 2, which is typically at 208 volts or 240 volts. Pretty wide range of electrical demand. Could be something as relatively minor as an electric stove at your home. Some of them can get quite large, though. Seen some up to, like I said, 19.2 kilowatts, which is pretty significant. And then last but certainly not least, the DC fast charging. It's typically done at 480 volts, requires three-phase electric service. There are various levels of electrical demand. Most of the time I'm seeing them above 50 kilowatts per unit. And as most of you probably know, these can charge a battery in 20 to 30, 80% of the capacity in 20 to 30 minutes, obviously depending on the size of the battery you're working with. So just wanted to lay that out, and because that's what most of this we'll be talking about going forward. So first, some what I think are pretty interesting energy regulatory considerations when it comes to EV charging. So as some of you may know, states regulate the retail sale of electricity, which is the sale of electricity to the end user. And EV charging presents an interesting issue because now we have potentially entities other than kind of your incumbent public utility that are going to be arguably selling electricity to people that come and want to charge their cars. Particularly in public places, or it could be at a workplace, basically any place other than someone's home. Most states have already addressed this issue either legislatively or through their public utility commissions, and they've thankfully determined that EV charging is a service rather than a sale of electricity or resale. So that's kind of how a lot of those states get around it. There are probably right now, I'd say between 5 to 10 states that haven't really addressed it square on, and so that kind of that presents some potential ambiguities in those states. And even in states that have addressed it, there are still certain ambiguities. So one question is, how do you price it? Can you price it per kilowatt hour? So kilowatt hours are the units of electricity, and that's typically how it's priced. So when you buy electricity for your home from a utility, you might be paying, 12 or 15 cents a kilowatt hour, depending on where you are in the country. And typically, certainly the utilities, that's how they price their service. It's per kilowatt hour. Some states, when they've addressed this issue with EV charging, there's an open question as to whether those EV charging service providers can charge per kilowatt hour and not be considered a public utility or an electricity supplier, as the case may be in certain states. Again, most states have addressed this, and they've taken it out of the equation either legislatively or administratively. But there are a couple states where they say, yes, you can. I'll give you an example. I think Nebraska is one of them, where they say, okay, yeah, generally we think, EV charging is a service. You're not acting as a public utility or anything like that. But you can't charge by the kilowatt hour, so you have to come up with something else. You charge by the hour, so maybe it's $2 an hour to charge. Of course, you can give it away for free. That's always an option. Can you do it through a monthly subscription? That's another option. So that's one key ambiguity. Another really interesting one, and this is something that's it's actually present in my home state, Virginia, where the legislation that's addressed this issue, it basically says, okay, EV charging is a service, it's not the resale of electricity, provided that the EV charging service provider first procures that electricity from the electric utility who's authorized to serve that area. So in general, for a lot of people, that's not a big issue, but for folks that want to get into, say, like using their own solar panels to serve those chargers and to charge people for it, that creates an issue. And there's more than just Virginia that does it. There are a few states that have some wrinkle like that in there. So another thing to be cognizant about if you're looking to get into the EV charging business. Other states will include requirements that it's got to be solely used for transportation purposes. All right, that generally isn't a big deal if you got hooked up to a charging station, and you can't really do much else with that. But it is potentially an issue if you're providing, say, like 120 volt service, which are just like these wall outlets that we have going around here. Theoretically, someone could come in and plug their hairdryer in there or plug their laptop in there to charge it. And if you're going to charge them to use that, then that is not purely for transportation purposes. So some interesting wrinkles in here, in addition to a handful of states that haven't addressed it at all. Important to keep this in mind if you're getting into that business and you want to sell people or you want to charge people to charge their vehicles. The other interesting piece of this is some states where they allow electric competition, so you can choose your electricity supplier. They typically have fewer restrictions than some states where it's just like, no, it's one utility can serve this whole area and that's it. But again, in those states, you may be able to do it to charge people to plug in their vehicles, but the question remains, well, does that make you an electricity supplier? So you're not quite a public utility or public service corporation, but you may have to get a license to be, because you're considered an electricity supplier. Again, most states have addressed this, but there are a handful of others that have not. So these are, this is always, to me, one of the most fascinating issues. I'm a state energy regulatory attorney and environmental attorney, so I kind of geek out on this stuff. So, but it's very interesting how those issues manifest themselves. Another big question that's becoming more and more prevalent now is who should own the publicly accessible charging stations or electric vehicle supply equipment. So what types of entities can do it? Generally, over the past several years, there haven't been many restrictions on it, subject to some of the caveats that I discussed before. Initially, there were concerns that public utilities would have an unfair competitive advantage over non-utilities, because the advantage with public utilities is that you can invest in money and you can socialize the cost over millions of ratepayers potentially. So it's literally, fractions of a penny on the dollar. Whereas some other, say, non-utilities who have to figure out some other way to charge for their service, whether it's by hour or by a subscription fee, it's tough to come up with something that will recoup the investment costs in a reasonable amount of time without scaring people away with the prices. But what I've started to notice has been happening lately is that as we get kind of more public policy mandates to kind of hasten the deployment of EV charging infrastructure, we're starting to see that some entities that were initially hesitant about getting the public utilities involved are now pushing the public utilities to get involved, and some states are requiring it. And again, the reason for that is whether it's in the context of rebate programs where the utilities can offer, $2,000 if you install a charging station at your house, or whether it's the actual public utilities will own and operate the charging infrastructure themselves. Again, the benefit is socializing these costs across a broad number of people. And so there are some dockets going on in front of various state public utility commissions where they're trying to sort through these issues. And where there used to be competitive concerns, now a lot of that has shifted more to, hey, wait, maybe we don't want to exclude them from participating. Maybe we should take advantage of the way that they can do this in a reasonably cost-efficient manner. And this just kind of gets talked about the pricing, different pricing options. This to me is always a tricky one because it's, getting the infrastructure in and installed is fairly expensive. And, most charging events, if you're in a public spot, they don't last for, 8 to 10 hours that you might be plugged in at home. You're in them for a fairly short amount of time. So how do you price it? Some people will give it away as a perk of coming to their restaurant or their grocery store. That's great. Some states you can charge per the kilowatt hour, so you can just you can make sure you're recovering whatever you're paying the utility for that electricity plus some additional adder. Some others have a time-based model, $2, $3, $5 an hour, whatever. Others, as you probably know, there are some providers that have subscription services where you pay like per month or annually, you get unlimited charging or up to a certain amount. So different models to do it. But the thing I would say, regardless of what model you choose, if you're operating particularly in a non-residential environment, and you're using some of the higher powered chargers, watch out for the demand charges. Those are components of electric utility rates that are typically assessed to non-residential customers, where in addition to a volumetric cost per kilowatt hour, they also charge a flat fee, say maybe $2 per kilowatt, and it's based on the peak demand that is incurred in that particular billing month. So for example, if you have a 50 kilowatt DC fast charging station, even if someone uses it for 10 minutes once a month, you're going to have a demand charge that's going to be 50 kilowatts times some amount, $3, $4, $5 an hour, or $5, and so that'll be several $100s just for that. So that's a potential issue when you're dealing with infrastructure that has a high energy demand, but you don't really use it for a long period of time. Next thing, switching gears, talking about state and local government issues. So this is something that sometimes people will ask me, well, are there any requirements for charging station manufacturers that they have to follow when they build these products before they sell them? Generally speaking, the requirements are not really, the design standards are not really enforced on the manufacturers or developers. Where they get enforced is when they're installed. And typically where we see that is in the state building codes and also through the local electrical inspectors who typically adopt the National Electric Code. And this Article 625 of the National Electric Code is specific to EV charging equipment. One thing of particular note is that for any jurisdiction that follows these requirements, generally the charging stations must be UL listed. I've got here in the slide several potentially relevant UL certifications, and they're also within them, those cross-reference to other ones. So again, we recently helped a client who's an EV charging manufacturer coming from Europe into the US, and we had to say, hey, wait a second, no one's going to come after you directly, but if you want to sell these, and get them installed, then this is all the stuff you need to comply with, because when it comes time to installing them, the local building or electrical inspectors aren't going to do it. So that's something that I think sometimes flies under the radar, particularly for folks who aren't used to dealing with this type of infrastructure. The other thing is, this one always makes me laugh sometimes, zoning considerations. So typically, if you think we're talking about charging stations at an office building or parking lot or store, they just kind of considered accessory uses to whatever that existing non-residential building or facility is. I saw one locality, I forget where it was, but just with the way that it was interpreted relative to their local code, it fit under the definition, or the locality took the position that it fit under the definition of an underground petroleum storage tank, which is crazy to me. But again, when you're dealing with localities who haven't really seen much of this before, it's a new issue, and the tendency is to try to cram it into something that exists that usually is a terrible fit. So, you know, certainly in larger cities, they've kind of dealt with this issue now. But if you're moving into new markets where there's not a lot of it already on the ground, there's some quirky issues that could come up. The other thing too, when you're installing charging stations in some type of public location, say on along the road or in a public parking lot, you might need to get some various permits or right-of-way approvals from the local government. So this example is just some like along the street. So I know certainly in the city of Richmond, where I am from, you would need to get permission from the city to put them within the public right-of-way. Also may need some types of easements or other special permits. Another interesting one, Americans with Disabilities Act. I know it's tough to see that graphic there, but in a nutshell, places of public accommodation need to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Very unhelpfully, the ADA uses incredibly broad language that's really impossible to practically apply and interpret. Fortunately, we have the U.S. Access Board, who has published these design recommendations for accessible EV charging stations. And it goes into all sorts of things like the actual physical requirements, like you see in that diagram there. But it also goes into stuff like how many parking spaces need to be equipped with a charging station. So normally the United States Department of Justice is kind of the lead agency for enforcing the ADA, but where we're seeing a lot of this more regularly, and I think this example, again, I know it's hard to see, the table I have clipped out here is from California. Some states in their building codes have already adopted more aggressive standards where it's, okay, these new buildings have to come, you need to have so many spots that have charging stations. And so you may see that enforced again at the local or the state level. Finally, just wrap up with some environmental considerations. Thankfully, these are usually not too bad in my experience. The most common ones are, if you get land disturbance permits, construction, stormwater, erosion, sediment control. Typically, you may have to worry about all of those where you're, like in this location where you're looks like constructing on top of a paved surface. But the interesting thing too is that, particularly in some of the areas like in the Northeast where I grew up, where there's a lot of soil contamination, when you are digging up to put this stuff in the ground, then you may have to deal with removing contaminated soils. And again, I've been involved with some other types of projects in like New Jersey and New York. There's a lot of contaminated soil in parts of the Northeast. So that's something, really to be concerned about and keep an eye on. And, where you deal more with like storm waters if you went to a greenfield site, for example, or doing something new. But again, in the grand scheme of things, from environmental considerations, it's relatively minor. But that's just what I was going to run through, just some regulatory considerations for everyone to consider as they're deploying charging stations. Happy to take any questions, and I can hang around afterwards too. Yes?
Loved it. Could you go back one slide, please?
Sure.
not an environmental consideration, but it looks to me suspiciously like they've trenched between those different charging systems
Mhm.
and didn't get the parking lot level, so they leave themselves a water. That's just bad liability practice when it freezes over.
Right. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There will be, and that's part of some of the like the land disturbance permits and those similar types of regulations where that stuff may apply, or some of the local permits you may need to get from the locality to do that, where that stuff may be addressed for sure. But yeah, yes, I should clarify. These are not all the possible regulatory issues that you may run into. These are just the frequent ones that I've seen, and the ones that I think come to mind first in terms of giving people heartburn. All right. Well, I'll be around here for a little bit. I think we got ready for our next speaker. All right. Dinesh? I think.
Left, right.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.